To preamp or not to preamp? That's the question I ask myself when I use the Decware Zen Sarah 300B tube amplifier. Because you can use it with a preamp or without a preamp. Let me first preface by saying that I absolutely love the current sound of my preamp. My preamp is a Melody 1688 Signature Series. I absolutely love this preamp. It is a preamp that has 3 analog outputs, 1 high gain RCA, 1 low gain RCA, and 1 XLR. I use this amplifier to triamp my homemade DIY speakers. I love the current sound flavor that this preamp has. I've achieved this flavor through time and lots of trial and error by tube rolling. It has a mix of both old punchy sound that the Raytheon 6SN7s are bringing in with a mix of that ultra clean, super quiet background of Linley Elite 6SN7 tubes. That's right. I mixed 2 different kinds of 6SN7s per side. Each side has 1 new old stock Raytheon 6SN7 and brand new current models Linley Elite 6SN7. Both are playing together. Combined with a super rectifier that is using an 845 tube, my preamp right now as it stands is tailored specifically to my sonic tastes. So what happens to the sound when I stop using my preamp with the Decware 300B amplifier? What are the differences? When I removed my preamp from the equation, I was a little bit skeptical. Hear me out. I wasn't skeptical that the sound would be worse by using the Sarah amp on its own. No. I was actually confident that some things would actually sound better with the Sarah amp on its own. What I was skeptical about was in terms of the final flavor, the tone, the feel of the instruments. That is very personal to each and every one of us. We all have a certain tonality that resonates more with us compared to our audiophile next door.
What about the mids? Where's the mids? What about the mids?
You call that a soundstage?
We all have this level that we're comfortable with. Some people like a big, fat, large stereo image. Others absolutely hate it. Others like a much more precise, focused, somewhat smaller stereo image, but to them, that's what they enjoy. And I've achieved my sonic flavor over time. You can't do this overnight. It takes months and months, and actually, it takes years to understand your system and know what tubes to experiment with to try to get to the sonic flavor that you're looking for. It took me a while to do this. Don't try to rush this. You try to rush this, doomed. Doomed, doomed, doomed. You're just going to spend so much money, and every time you are going to roll a different tube, you are going to gain something, but you are going to lose something, and you are not going to know why. Take your time. And if I could give you a roadmap that is specific with a yes or no answer along every turn, I would. I don't think anybody can give you this. So think of this sonic flavor. My preamp is like my grandmother's lasagna recipe that I grew up on. That is what I want. That is what I like. That is what is comforting to me. Now, I can go to a Michelin star restaurant and have a top-notch chef make me a Michelin star lasagna. Sure, I will agree and understand and see why this lasagna is totally next level. And the next time I'm in the mood for lasagna, it might be my grandmother's recipe that I crave. Maybe not. We're all different. We've all tried something that once we see what the next level is, it's hard to come back. But it doesn't always apply. Sometimes seeing the next level makes us appreciate what we're comfortable with. The separation of instruments from the singer to all the layers, way better when the Decware is on its own. Way better. The background's darker, background's quieter. You also feel a little bit more of the sonic differences when you tube roll the tubes on the Sarah amplifier when you use the amplifier on its own without a preamp. Yep. The overall precision in the stereo image is much more laser focused when I use the Zen Sarah on its own without my preamp. And actually, this focus actually made me turn the tweeters off on my Ladybug baffles. That's right, just using the full range driver. The full range driver on its own was giving me more than enough textured and resolution. I didn't need those tweeters. I really didn't. I spent a couple days listening to the Decware amp on its own. And then I went back to my preamp to analyze and understand what my preamp was actually doing. So with my preamp, the notes in the soundstage felt larger, but it wasn't as focused. So the tones, they now had like a hint of that live music distortion with the preamp. And it all comes from the choice of tubes that I have in there. 6SN7s are a noisy distortion tube, relatively speaking. So this extra distortion that it was given, it's a pleasant kind of distortion. It's a live music kind of distortion. It gave character to the sound. Just like my grandmother's lasagna, by her not measuring the amount of salt and seasoning that she puts in there. She eyeballs it, goes by her palate. So even though the tones, to me, felt more like a live music experience that I have heard in my life, it unfortunately also came at the fact that the background wasn't as quiet. It wasn't as dark as when the Decware is on its own. So the other thing here, what I found interesting, and this could be specific to my preamp, and if any of you have experienced this, I'm really curious to hear you guys in the comments, or girls. That's right, I think we're at a 2% ratio of girls now, according to YouTube stats. Isn't that nuts? Anyways, one of those things that was happening with my preamp in the mix is I find myself playing with the volume when I switch genres. Occasionally when I just switch albums or artists, because they're not all recorded equal. They're really not. And I disable all form of volume normalization on my streamer or on the app. I don't want that. Just give it to me raw. Do not add any filters. I'll deal with the rawness I want. I want to keep all those dynamics as much as possible. So with my preamp, what I experience most of the time is I find myself playing with the volume. A couple notches up on some songs, I got to reduce it on other songs if I want to maintain that level of experience. Say I'm aiming between a 75 and 85 decibel experience in the room, so that the average is like between around 78, 79, with peaks to 85, 86, and that's okay. But then I'll switch tracks to a completely different album of a different artist, and now I'm peaking at 89, almost 90 at times. Okay, then bring it down a little bit. So there's always a big fluctuation using my preamp in this mix, and I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's the gain factor on my preamp combined with the amplifier. And actually, this was true when I used some specific solid state amp like the Galion. Again, this was very true because the Galion had a high gain factor on the amp. It made the differences in gain changes from one type of music to the next being even more felt. So it's not a big deal. I mean, I got the remote next to me and I'm adjusting as I go. But when I used the Decware on its own, this was much less of an issue. Much less of an issue. And thankfully so, because I don't have a remote to control the volume on the Decware. The volume is two knobs. I really shouldn't do this motion. There's two knobs, the left and the right, to adjust the volume on the Decware. But I walked up to it, set it to about 60, 65% of what it was, hit play, looked at my decibel meter, and it said 75, 78, peaking at 82, 83. I was like, perfect. That's my comfort zone. That's what I like. I like listening at that range. Sat back down and changed genres. Went to opera, back to rock, go to blues, go to these little audiophile acoustic shitty tracks to test the details, the textures, the sound staging. Albums that are recorded with like a Q sound similar to Roger Waters' album. Played around. went back to the 60s recording, listened to some Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, then listened to some Leonard Skinner, some Led Zeppelin, some Rolling Stones, Jethro Tull. Yeah, all of these. Then went to even orchestral, like big pieces, like the Hans Zimmer experience. Never felt the need to get up and change the volume. So there was definitely something going on there between my preamp and the gain factor on the Decware, for sure. And actually, come to think of it, this gain change between tracks and artists when I switch is not as felt when I use my preamp if I set the volume level on the Decware to under 80%. If I max it at 100%, so full gain out of the Decware when I use my preamp, the issue is even more prominent. So yeah, I can have some classical tracks that I have to increase the volume by about 15 to 20% more to stay in that sweet spot because the gain is so much lower. And then the opposite effect is just nasty when you don't realize you've been listening to classical for like an hour, and then you're like, yeah, okay, I'm in the mood for some rock and roll. Go to rock and roll, forget to adjust the volume knob, bang! Yeah. So there's a bunch of tubes on this. Therefore, there are a ton of sonic combinations that you can achieve by tube rolling. So in the last video, if you haven't caught the last video, check it out. It's in the link. The link is in the description of this video. I talk about the nature of the 300Bs when I played with 4 different sets of 300Bs. Now I'm going to share a little bit of my experiences on tube rolling other tubes here. Now, straight off the bat, I have not played with these. These have always remained the same. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if I were to map out all these possibilities, let's look at these possibilities. There are tons of variations that you could do. So, first you have, I think this is called the input tube. This is a 12AU7. I have currently here a new old stock RCA long gray plates. I've also tried a long black plate. So the long gray plate with the combination of these tubes in here, this tube and a 300B, this one I was able to play with the characteristics of the mid-range and the air. So the long gray plates gives the amplifier a much more balanced, airy, and clean sound, whereas when I put the long black plates, also an RCA new old stock, the whole characteristics of the amp changed. Now I had a little bit more forwardness in the mid-range, which came with a little bit of extra warmth and came at the cost of sacrificing a little bit of that airiness, just a tiny bit. It was still fantastic. So you can definitely change the voicing simply by changing this tube, and you can start playing with your tonal balance, basically from the highs, the mids, in relationship with the lows, depending on which 12AU7 you choose to use. Now, Steve was really nice enough to send me an arsenal of tubes. Come on. Right. Never touch tubes with your bare hands, by the way. It's a bad idea, but I am a professional, so I can do whatever the fuck I want. So these, they labeled them as VR75s, which are these little dark ones, and a set of VR105s, which is a little bit bigger, right? If we were to compare, big difference. So these ones, the 105s, when you have 3 105s, I think you have to have 3 matching sets here. So when you have a matching set of the 105s, this I found gave the amplifier a much more open sound, a much more, not bright, just higher resolution, more clarity. Felt like there was more depth. But when I use the VR75 ones, these little dark ones, interestingly, they're dark. It also, I found that these provided an overall darker tone to the amplifier, a little bit darker tone. What do I mean by darker tone? So when I listen to this, the airiness of these 105s, this to me sounded absolutely better for anything that is jazz, blues, classical, and opera. When I brought in these little 75 ones, where the sound seems a little bit darker, and at first glance, if you're listening to jazz, it'll feel like everything's a little bit more tightened in the same space. It doesn't feel as big and open. Sure, for jazz and blues, that's what it felt like. It's when I put in these old school classic rock recordings or metal recordings, this sounded much better to me. It made the tone of the electric guitar seem that much more in your face, had more bite. Even though everything else seems like everything's a little bit tighter maybe, you had a lot better experience. I was actually capable of listening to the entire Ride the Lightning album by Metallica. I can't listen to the whole album of Ride the Lightning with this tube. I just can't. The darker sound with the 75, I found that old school recordings, especially in the classic rock or even modern metal, sounded better with the 75 tubes. Now, just by factoring these two sets, 12AU7 and the voltage tubes, by changing this one or these, the possibilities of different tonal characteristics in the voicing of the amp that you can achieve is exponential. Using the 105s, the voltage tubes, having 3 105s in this section with, say, the Western Electric 300Bs, it will be super airy, extremely airy, high resolution, beautiful mids, just a hint on the warm side. But if you're a fan of that warmth, replace this one with long black plates or a warm sounding 12AU7, now you're still going to have that airiness, but in the space of mid-range warmth. You're going to get all that. So this is the fun of tube rolling. And like I said, I wish I could map all this out, but I can't. It's just too big, it's too long, it's too complicated, and it would take forever to listen to all this to really get a good idea. Now, there are some tube nuts out there that have been into tubes for like 50 years and can go down to the detailed construction of each of these tubes, and simply by understanding the construction of the tubes, we'll have a great idea what those tubes will bring in terms of contribution. But ladies and gentlemen, your amount of options and flavors that you can choose by rolling this one, these three, these two drivers, and the output tubes, the 300Bs, possibilities are enormous. Enormous. Another fantastic functionality that the Zen Sarah 300B brings you in your tube world. To be able to have that freedom is amazing. And on top of that, like I mentioned in the first video, having your control independently of each channel. Should you have new old stock tubes that happen to not be perfectly matched on each side, you simply can adjust this with the volume. Also, should you get a 300B tube that is now providing a little hum, this is why you have the hum adjustment knobs that you can fine tune to eliminate the hum. So far, out of all the 4 sets of 300Bs I've used, out of all the tubes I've tried here, except for these, I haven't replaced those, I have not had a situation where the knobs were not capable of removing that hum. So, phenomenal. Phenomenal amplifier, very versatile. You can have all these types of different sound characteristics. Being able to play with all this over time in the ownership of this amplifier, it feels to me future-proof in terms of my taste when it comes to sonic character, because I will always be able to try different tubes, play with different tube combinations to see what I like at the time that I like. Our tastes change, mine do. I'll enjoy something for a period of time, and then I'll discover maybe a type of music, an artist, or a new album that makes me go on a different tangent for a while, and then I might change a few tubes in the amplifier, or in my preamp, or in my DAC. That's the Decware Zen Sarah 300B with a preamp, without a preamp, 5 sources of tube rolling, voicing switches, independent volume channel controls, and on-the-fly impedance load for your speakers. Choose high or low. Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you see and you want me to keep doing this, hit like, hit subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Drop me a comment down below. I love to read all of your comments. It's a lot of fun. It makes this feel more real. It doesn't feel like I'm making videos for a bunch of robots. So, yeah. And guys, have a good day.